There's a certain freedom in driving alone, one that feels both thrilling and a little terrifying. I was 25, with no passenger beside me, no music blaring to fill the silence, just the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my own thoughts. I had set out that morning with no fixed destination, only a vague promise to myself. Keep moving until your heart feels lighter. The road ahead stretched like a ribbon laid across an endless patchwork of dry fields and scattered trees. Now and then, a hawk circled lazily above, its shadow sweeping over the cracked asphalt. The air was warm, the sky painted in slow strokes of orange and pink as the sun dipped lower. I felt suspended in a kind of timeless moment, my world reduced to the narrow strip of road, the changing colors above, and the sound of tires rolling steadily beneath me. I told myself I was out here for adventure, for the love of the open road, but the truth was simpler and heavier. I needed space. Space from familiar streets, where every corner carried a memory. Space from the people who meant well, but never quite knew what to say. Life had been noisy lately, too tangled with expectations and disappointments, and I needed the quiet to think. Or maybe I needed the quiet so I wouldn't have to think at all. I remember glancing at the fuel gauge, noting I still had enough to get me well into the next town. My hands were loose on the steering wheel, the windows cracked open just enough to let the late summer wind brush against my skin. Everything felt still, safe. And then, bang! The sound ripped through the calm like a gunshot. The steering wheel jerked violently to the left. My heart leapt into my throat as the car wobbled and pulled. Instinct kicked in. I gripped the wheel, eased my foot off the gas, and steered the car onto the dusty shoulder. The crunch of gravel under my tires was louder than it should have been. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, my pulse racing. Slowly, I climbed out and circled the car. The rear tire on the driver's side was done for, its sidewall ripped open, rubber frayed like a torn fabric. A deep sigh escaped me. I wasn't helpless. I'd changed a tire before, once, maybe twice, but both times had been in well-lit driveways with someone hovering nearby to guide me. This was different. This was a lonely road with no other cars in sight, no streetlights, and a sun that was now halfway below the horizon. Still, I rolled up my sleeves. The trunk creaked open, and I dug out the spare tire and the jack, setting them on the ground. The air carried the dry scent of dust and faint hints of sage. Kneeling beside the car, I began the process, loosening lug nuts, setting the jack, cranking slowly. My hands were already smudged with dirt, and the heat of the day was fading fast. The silence was starting to feel heavier, almost pressing. Every now and then, the wind stirred through the grass, and I'd glance up, half expecting to see someone, or something, approaching. But there was nothing, just a long, empty road disappearing in both directions, swallowed by the horizon. Halfway through the process, frustration began to creep in. The jack was stiff, the lug wrench kept slipping from my grip, and the spare looked suspiciously underinflated. I muttered under my breath, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. My shoulders ached from leaning over, and the dirt beneath my knees was rough. The sun was slipping lower, shadows growing longer, the sky turning a deeper shade of gold with streaks of crimson. I caught myself glancing toward the west, as if the horizon might offer some hint of rescue. But the road stayed empty. A flicker of unease brushed over me. I wasn't afraid exactly, but I was very aware of how alone I was. This wasn't the kind of road where people passed every few minutes. This was the kind of road where hours could stretch without another soul appearing. I paused, leaning back against the car, wiping the sweat and dust from my forehead. The tire still wasn't fixed, and I could feel the air cooling with each passing minute. I told myself I could handle this. I just needed to keep at it until it was done. Determination was a thin shield, but it was all I had. So I went back to work, my hands moving slower now, my ears tuned to every sound. The whisper of grass, the faint creak of the jack, my own breathing. Somewhere above, a lone bird called out before the night settled in. I glanced up at the dimming sky and felt a strange mix of emotions, frustration, fatigue, but also a kind of stubborn pride. I was here, I was handling it, and I would get through this. Or so I thought. I was tightening the last lug nut I could manage when I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. My head snapped up. For a moment, my heart stuttered. The road had been empty for so long that any sound felt strange, almost unnatural. From the far side of the ditch, a figure emerged, moving slowly but steadily toward me. An old man. He looked to be in his late 60s, maybe older, the kind of age where every line on the face feels earned. His skin was weathered, the deep grooves around his mouth and eyes telling stories I could only guess at. A cap shaded his forehead, and wisps of silver hair peeked out from beneath it. He wore simple clothes, faded jeans, a button-up shirt that had seen better days, and scuffed leather boots. One hand rested on a walking stick, though his gait suggested he could manage without it. "You look like you've had better evenings," he said, voice low and steady, carrying just enough warmth to disarm me a little. I straightened, brushing my dusty hands on my jeans. Tire blew out. I've been trying to change it, but I glanced at the spare and then back at him. I'm not sure it's going to hold. He nodded slowly, eyes scanning the car, then me. His gaze wasn't sharp or suspicious, just observant, like he was measuring the situation. "My place is just over there," he said, gesturing down a narrow path that disappeared into a cluster of trees. "Got tools, a proper pump. We can have that tire fixed up before it gets too dark." My first instinct was hesitation. The rational part of my brain whispered reminders about strangers, remote places, and the kinds of headlines that start with "traveler goes missing." But the other part of me, the tired, dusty, stranded part, looked at his steady eyes and saw no malice there. Only the quiet certainty of someone who knew these roads far better than I did. "I appreciate the offer," I said cautiously, "but I don't want to trouble you." "Trouble?" He chuckled, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of 100 similar encounters. "Son, I've lived out here 40 years. If we didn't help each other when we could, we'd all be worse off. Come on, before the coyotes decide to introduce themselves." It was that last sentence, delivered with a matter-of-fact tone, that nudged me toward decision. I glanced at the sky. The sun was nearly gone, and a pale moon was beginning to show. I could keep struggling with this in the dark, or I could take a chance. "All right," I said finally. We walked side by side down the path, the gravel crunching softly under our feet. He didn't fill the silence with small talk, and I found myself grateful for it. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of pine and something else, with smoke maybe. Within a few minutes, the trees opened to reveal a small house set back from the road. It was modest in size, with a sloped roof and a porch light glowing warmly in the dusk. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the darkening sky. As we stepped onto the porch, I noticed the details: a pair of worn rocking chairs, a neatly stacked pile of firewood, and a faded welcome mat that looked like it had been greeting visitors for decades. The old man pushed the door open and motioned me inside. The first thing that hit me was the warmth, both from the small wood stove in the corner and from the space itself. The air carried the comforting scent of burning pine mixed with something savory, like soup simmering slowly in a pot. The light was soft, golden, spilling from lamps that seemed to have been there forever. The walls were lined with shelves holding old books, tin mugs, and framed photographs of people I didn't know. A quilt hung over the back of the couch that looked as if it had been sat on 1,000 times. Everything about the place radiated a kind of quiet history, as if the house itself had been a witness to countless evenings like this. "Set your things down anywhere," he said, moving toward a workbench near the door. "Let's have a look at that tire of yours." I followed, placing the spare carefully on the bench. He bent over it with a practiced hand, running his fingers along the rubber, then giving a small nod. "Nothing a little air and patching won't fix." Something in me relaxed, not just about the tire, but about being here. There was a stillness to the room, the kind that made you realize just how much noise you carry with you without even knowing it. I didn't know this man. I didn't know his name yet. But in that moment, standing in the warm glow of his home, I felt the first real flicker of safety since the tire had blown. The old man rolled the tire toward the workbench like it was second nature, his movements slow but sure. He didn't waste energy, didn't fumble. Every motion felt deliberate, born of years spent fixing things with his own hands. I stood nearby, unsure at first whether to offer help or just stay out of the way. "Hand me that rag, would you?" he said without looking up. The simple request broke the hesitation. I found the rag and placed it in his palm. His hands were rough, the kind of rough that only comes from decades of honest work. As he cleaned the rim, he glanced over at me with a half smile. You know, out here, we call this kind of thing a roadside handshake. Flat tire's just another way of saying hello to your neighbors. I let out a short laugh. If this is your idea of a handshake, I'd hate to see what a full greeting looks like. He chuckled low in his throat and kept working, fitting the patched inner lining with quiet efficiency. Full greeting involves pie, he said. Sometimes stew. Depends on the weather. The conversation found its rhythm from there, light and easy, like we'd known each other a little longer than we actually had. He told me about the winters here, how the snow sometimes piled so high that the only way to get to the main road was with a snowmobile. I told him about the trip I'd been on, though I kept the deeper reasons vague. At one point, as he tightened the seal, he said, I used to drive a lot when I was your age. Not for work, just to see where the road would take me. Doesn't matter how much the world changes, there's always something out there worth finding. I think that's what I'm hoping for, I admitted. He glanced at me, eyes softening just a fraction. You will, usually when you least expect it. By now, the light from the workbench lamp cast a warm halo over the tools. Outside the small window, the sky had gone from deep purple to full night, stars beginning to appear between drifting clouds. The air in the room smelled faintly of rubber and would smoke, a strangely comforting mix. Tea? He asked suddenly. I hesitated. Sure. He set the tire aside for a moment and shuffled to the stove. From a shelf above it, he took down two mismatched mugs. The kettle hissed quietly as he poured, and soon the room filled with the earthy scent of strong black tea. He handed me a mug, the heat seeping into my cold hands. We sat at a small table in the corner, the tire propped against the wall like it was just another guest. He sipped his tea, gazed far away for a moment before leaning back in his chair. You ever get caught in a real storm? He asked. Not really, I said. A few heavy rains, but nothing serious. He nodded slowly, like that was a blessing. Out here, the storms don't play around. Wind can tear the roof off if you're not careful. Snow'll trap you in for days. One time, must have been 20 years back, two travelers broke down right outside during a blizzard. I kept them here for 3 days till the plows came through. Funny thing is, they ended up sending me postcards for years after. Something about the way he told it made me smile. Guess you've been the hero of the road more than once. He waved a hand dismissively. Not a hero, just someone who's got an extra blanket and a kettle of tea. You'd be surprised how far that goes. We talked like that for a while, small stories, half jokes, the kind of conversation that doesn't demand anything from you. I told him about the time my GPS had led me to a dead-end dirt road in the middle of nowhere. He countered with a story about a shortcut he'd once taken that ended in a field of sheep and a very unimpressed farmer. Each laugh we shared felt like it sanded down the edges of my earlier unease. The room seemed smaller now, not in a cramped way, but in that way cozy places do when you're starting to feel at home in them. At some point, he glanced toward the clock on the wall. The hand were inching past 9. You planning to keep driving tonight? He asked, his voice casual but carrying a note of concern. I hesitated. That was the plan, I guess. He sipped his tea, then set the mug down with a quiet clink. Not the safest idea. Roads out here get tricky after dark. No lights, no traffic, and more wildlife than you believe. I've seen more than a few drivers run into trouble thinking they could make it to the next town. I thought about it. The idea of being back on that lonely road in full darkness, with no cell service and who knew what wandering the ditches, it wasn't appealing. Still, part of me resisted the thought of staying. He seemed to read my mind. Look, you're welcome to crash here for the night. Couch is clean. I've got extra blankets. You'll be on your way in the morning with daylight on your side. I studied his face for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. Just steady, patient kindness. All right, I said finally. Thank you. He gave a small nod, as if it was already settled. Good. Now finish that tea. Tire still needs another minute before we call it done. I smiled into my cup, feeling that earlier tension continue to fade. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the bare branches against the house. But inside, with the hum of the stove and the quiet company of a man who had clearly seen many nights like this. The road didn't feel so far away anymore. When the tea was gone and the tire finally fixed, I thought there might be an awkward moment. Me gathering my things, him wishing me well, both of us pretending it wasn't already too dark for the road. But instead, he moved with quiet certainty, as though my staying the night had been decided the moment he'd invited me in. "Couch is in the corner," he said, pointing toward a small space tucked between the stove and a bookshelf. "Blankets are in the chest. They're heavy ones, good for a night like this." I set my bag down beside the couch. It was worn but clean, the fabric faded in a way that spoke more of years of use than neglect. A thick quilt lay folded on the armrest, patterned in blues and browns that looked handmade. As I pulled off my jacket, he returned from the kitchen carrying 2 more steaming mugs, this time chamomile. "Helps the night go down easy," he said, setting one in front of me. We sat again at the little table, but this time the conversation shifted. Gone were the light jokes about broken-down cars and country roads. The room felt softer, the lamplight pooling between us like a small campfire in the dark. He started with a story about the house, how it had belonged to his parents, how he'd grown up here, left for a time, and then come back after his father's passing. His voice slowed when he spoke of his late wife, Mary. 41 years, he said quietly. "Some days it feels like yesterday, others like it was in another lifetime." I didn't push for details, but he shared them anyway. Her love for tending flowers, the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd insisted they never leave the porch light off, even in summer. Said it made the house look friendlier to travelers, he added with a faint smile. Something about the way he spoke loosened the knot in my own chest. I found myself telling him about my life. Not the casual version I gave to strangers, but the real one. How I'd left a job that no longer felt like mine. How I'd been drifting since, unsure where I was headed next. How the road trip had started as an escape, but had become a quiet search for something I couldn't name. He didn't offer quick fixes or easy wisdom. He just listened, really listened. The kind where you feel the other person is holding your words with care instead of waiting for their turn to speak. The wind outside began to rise, rattling the window panes. The sound was strangely comforting, like a reminder that the world beyond these walls could stay where it was for now. Inside, the warmth from the stove made the air heavy with a kind of peace I hadn't felt in months. After a while, the conversation slipped into silences that weren't awkward at all. They were the kind of silences you share with someone you've known long enough to not need words. Except here, that knowing had taken hours, not years. At one point, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Funny thing about the road. It'll take you places you didn't plan to go. Most of the time, those are the stops that matter." I thought about that for a moment, turning the phrase over in my mind. He was right. I wouldn't remember every gas station or town I passed, but I knew I'd remember this house, this night. When the tea was gone, he stood and said, "You should get some rest. Mornings come quick out here." He switched off one of the lamps, leaving just a soft glow from the stove. I settled onto the couch, pulling the quilt over me. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, maybe time itself. The fabric was warm against my skin, the weight of it pressing me gently into the cushions. From his side of the room, I heard the creak of his own bed, the settling of blankets. The wind moaned around the corners of the house, and the stove crackled softly. Somewhere far away, a branch tapped against the roof. I closed my eyes and let the warmth seep into me. My mind drifted back over the day, the sudden shock of the tire blowing, the long stretch of waiting, the first sight of him coming down that gravel path. I thought about how quickly the road could change, how a moment of trouble could lead to a place of unexpected safety. Just before sleep claimed me, I heard his voice from across the dim room. "Glad you stopped here tonight." I smiled in the dark, my eyes still closed. "Me too." And with that, I let the sound of the wind carry me into the kind of deep, untroubled sleep I hadn't known in a long time. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke to silence. Not the soft, steady quiet I'd fallen asleep to, but a heavier stillness, the kind that made you instantly aware something had changed. The faint hum of the old refrigerator was gone. The stove's glow had dimmed to embers. I blinked into the darkness, adjusting my eyes, and realized the power was out. For a moment, I just lay there under the quilt, listening. The wind outside still sighed through the trees, but the house felt different without the low hum of electricity. A few floorboards creaked from the temperature shift. Then I heard the slow shuffle of footsteps. The old man appeared in the dimness, carrying a small box of matches in one hand and a stubby candle in the other. He lit it with practiced ease, shielding the flame with his palm until it steadied. The soft, flickering glow spread across the room, painting the walls in golden shadow. "Power goes out sometimes," he said quietly, setting the candle on the table. "Usually comes back by morning." I pushed back the quilt and joined him, my bare feet touching the cool wooden floor. "Guess we're on nature's clock now." He gave a small grin. "That's the better clock, if you ask me." In the kitchen, he poured milk into a small saucepan, setting it on the wood stove where the embers still gave off enough heat. We sat at the table, the candle between us, the flame bending slightly with each draft from the old windows. "You know," he began, "people don't talk enough about patience these days. Everyone's in a rush to get somewhere, to fix something, to know all the answers." He leaned back in his chair, eyes reflecting the candlelight. "But some things you can't rush. Life will set its own pace, whether you like it or not." I listened, my hands wrapped around the mug he'd just filled with warm milk. The steam curled up toward my face, carrying the soft, almost sweet scent. He went on, "Out here, I learned that if you can't have patience, you won't last a season. Storms will keep you in for days. The road will wash out, and you'll just have to wait until it's fixed. No amount of worrying or pushing will change it. All you can do is keep warm, keep your spirits up, and be ready when the way opens again." I took a sip, letting the heat spread through me. "I think I've been doing the opposite lately," I admitted, "trying to push through everything, make things happen faster. And when it doesn't work, I get frustrated." He nodded like he understood all too well. "Frustration's just patience knocking at your door, trying to teach you something." We sat in quiet for a moment, the only sound a faint pop from the stove. The candlelight made the small kitchen feel even more intimate, like the rest of the world had shrunk away until it was just us, a table, and 2 mugs of milk. "Kindness works the same way," he said after a pause. "Doesn't matter who you meet, traveler, neighbor, stranger, give him kindness if you can. You may never see the results, but sometimes, years later, it comes back to you in ways you wouldn't believe." I thought about the fact that, only hours ago, I'd been stranded on the side of the road, unsure if anyone would come by. Now I was here, warm, safe, and sharing a midnight conversation that felt more valuable than sleep. "I don't know if I've said this yet," I told him, "but thank you. For all of it. For stopping, for bringing me here, for just being kind." He waved a hand like it was nothing. "Not kindness, just common sense. If the roles were reversed, I expect you'd have done the same." I wanted to tell him that maybe I wouldn't have, that maybe I'd have driven past, worried more about my own plans than someone else's trouble. But I didn't. Instead, I made myself a quiet promise right there at that table. If I ever came across someone who needed a hand, I'd stop. I'd make time. I'd remember this night. The candle burned lower, wax pooling at its base. The milk in our mugs dwindled to the last sips. Outside, the wind softened, and the house seemed to settle into a deeper stillness. When we finally rose from the table, it wasn't because the conversation had ended, but because the night had grown so peaceful we didn't need more words. He set the candle on the counter to keep burning and headed toward his bed, and I returned to the couch. As I lay back under the quilt, the faint smell of warm milk still in the air, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how rare it was to feel this way, grateful, safe, connected. Not in a grand, life-changing way, but in the simple, human way that mattered more than I'd realized. I closed my eyes with one last glance at the candle's flicker from across the room. It seemed to hold the whole night in its flame, patience, kindness, and the quiet certainty that I'd carry this memory for the rest of my life. The first thing I noticed when I woke up was the soft, golden glow filtering through the thin curtains. The air smelled faintly of freshly brewed tea and warm bread. For a brief moment, I forgot where I was, my mind still tangled in the peace of the night before. Then it came back to me, the roadside breakdown, the old man's kindness, the quiet conversations that stretched into the early hours. I sat up, stretching the stiffness from my limbs, and caught the faint sound of clinking plates from the other room. Pulling on my jacket, I stepped out to find him already bustling about in the small kitchen. He was humming softly to himself, the same way he had the night before, his movements unhurried yet purposeful. On the table, a simple breakfast was laid out: eggs, bread, a small bowl of jam, and 2 steaming cups of tea. "Good morning," I greeted, my voice still rough with sleep. He turned with a warm smile. "Ah, you're up. I thought I'd let you rest a bit longer." Traveling wears a person down more than they realize. I took a seat, and he slid a plate toward me. "Eat well before you go. The road ahead is long." We ate in comfortable silence at first, the kind where words aren't needed. The bread was still warm, the tea just the right balance of strong and soothing. I found myself watching him as he buttered his toast, his hands steady and practiced, like someone who had lived this quiet rhythm for many years. Halfway through the meal, he broke the silence. "You remind me of myself, you know. Many years ago, I used to travel like you, always moving, chasing something, or maybe running from it." His eyes didn't leave his plate, but I could hear the layers in his voice. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm doing a bit of both." He chuckled. "Aren't we all?" After breakfast, he disappeared into the pantry and came back with a small cloth bag. He began filling it with bread, a couple of apples, and a bottle of water. I protested at first, telling him it wasn't necessary, but he waved me off with a firm shake of his head. "You don't turn down kindness on the road," he said simply, tying the bag and placing it in my hands. "There's no telling when you might need it." When it came time to leave, he walked with me to my car. The morning air was cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. He crouched beside the wheel and checked the tire one last time, pressing it with his palm as if making sure his work from the night before would hold strong. "It's good," he said, straightening up. "It'll take you where you need to go." I stood there for a moment, unsure how to sum up my gratitude in words. Everything I thought to say felt too small for what I'd been given. Not just the shelter and the repairs, but the quiet, unspoken reminder that there were still people in the world who offered kindness without expecting anything in return. "Thank you," I finally said, my voice softer than I intended. "For everything." He gave a gentle nod, his smile as calm as the morning light. "Just keep going, and when you can, be the one who stops for someone else." I got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and rolled down the window. He stood there on the gravel driveway, hands tucked into his worn jacket pockets, the early sun catching the edges of his silver hair. I waved, and he lifted a hand in return, his figure growing smaller in the rearview mirror as I pulled back onto the road. The miles ahead felt different now. The weight I'd been carrying, though I hadn't fully realized it before, seemed lighter. The road stretched out in front of me, not as something to endure, but as something to embrace. And in that quiet stretch between one town and the next, I carried with me the warmth of that little roadside home, the old man's steady presence, and a reminder that even in the loneliest places, there are moments of connection worth remembering for a lifetime. The road ahead stretched endlessly, a silver ribbon disappearing into the horizon. The hum of the tires on the asphalt was steady and rhythmic, almost meditative, giving my thoughts room to wander. As the miles passed beneath me, I kept replaying the past day in my mind. The unexpected stop, the quiet kitchen, the old man's patient hands repairing my tire, the way he waved goodbye without asking for anything in return. Somewhere between the morning light and the open road, something inside me had shifted. I'd always thought of myself as independent, self-sufficient, maybe even a little hardened by experience. I'd learned to keep moving, to expect little from strangers, to trust only myself. But in those brief hours, the old man had chipped away at that guarded layer without even trying. His kindness had been so simple, so unadorned, that it was impossible to question. There had been no hidden motive, no transaction, just a human being seeing another in need and choosing to help. As the scenery rolled by, fields, clusters of trees, the occasional farmhouse, I realized how rare that felt in my life. It wasn't that people weren't capable of kindness, but that I'd stopped looking for it, stopped believing it could come from nowhere. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken caution for wisdom and mistrust for strength. But now, I felt a little foolish and a little lighter. I thought about the bag of snacks sitting in the passenger seat, the bread still warm when he handed it to me. It wasn't just food. It was a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I sometimes told myself. That there are still people who will stop what they're doing to make sure you're all right. People who see you as a person, not a problem to avoid. And I found myself wondering, when would I get my turn? Not in a transactional sense, not to repay what had been given to me, but to pass it forward. Maybe someday I'd spot a stranded driver on the side of the road, or a traveler looking lost in a strange place, and I'd remember this moment. I'd stop. I'd help, because that's what we're meant to do, not to keep score, but to keep the chain of kindness alive. The thought brought a small, unshakable smile to my face. I could feel the road carrying me forward, but in a way, it was also carrying his generosity with me. Every mile put more distance between us, yet his presence lingered, woven into the morning light, the sound of the tires, and the steady beating of my heart. Sometimes we think it takes grand gestures to change a life, a huge sum of money, a heroic rescue, some defining moment carved into memory. But I was learning that it's often the opposite. It could be a warm breakfast on a cold morning, a bag of snacks pressed into your hands, away from the driveway as you head back into the unknown. These are the quiet moments that stay with you, not because they are extraordinary in scale, but because they are extraordinary in spirit. I don't know if I'll ever see him again. Maybe that's how it's meant to be. Some people are just brief stops on your journey, there to remind you that you're human, and so is everyone else you pass on the road. But I do know this. I'll remember him, and I'll remember how this morning felt. Sometimes, the smallest acts of kindness don't just brighten a day. They change the way you see the world. And when that happens, the road ahead doesn't just look longer, it looks brighter.